The Long Road Home, a ghost story. It was the summer of my 8th year. I remember because it was the same summer that everything seemed to be going wrong in our family. Grandma felt it would be best to get us children, there were 4 of us, away from home to help us forget the horror of the past few months, having been put in a tragic situation. I was not able to sleep well. Often I would wake in the middle of the night screaming and crying. Nothing could help me at those times, not even Grandma's tender care. The trip that we would take that summer was meant to cure me, and it did. In that long ago summer, in a place filled with the scent of yesterday, I found out the truth about myself and how one moment in time could change a life forever. Grandma took us to Meridian, Mississippi. It was so hot that you could see the air moving as though it were air above your fireplace with the flames burning bright. We were staying with my great-grandmother, Grandma's mother, in a house that was built before the Civil War. The pillars of the house were huge to an 8-year-old child. I remember being fascinated with the marble stone steps that led up to the wide porch that held swings and rocking chairs and tables with the lattice work. It was beautiful. It was old. It was like going back in time, finding yesterday in today. To a child that had just lost her mother, it almost seemed like heaven. And really, the world seemed a nicer place here in Mississippi. It felt as though I had gone home at last. The first weeks we were there, we 4 children found in the back of the house what my great-grandmother called a gully. It was a hole in the ground with red, rich clay, a place to play and get really dirty. We dug, we climbed those red clay walls of that deep hole. We were free at last, and the memory of what I had gone through before coming here to this place seemed to fade away, and those memories were replaced with laughter. The night screams were gone at last. The searching and longing for my lost mother was no longer haunting my every moment. One day in that gully, as I was digging in the rich earth, I saw a scrap of rotted cloth hanging out from the walls of the hole. I pulled again, and then gently, at first, but it didn't move. Then I yanked on that cloth hard, and I fell backwards. The skull of a human being landed in my lap. Cries of horror erupted from all 4 of us children as I watched my 2 brothers and my sister run away from me. Grandma came to the edge of the hole, saw me holding that tiny human skull, and she gasped before yelling to her mother to call the sheriff. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I do remember the sheriff's officers were everywhere. It brought back the memories that we were trying to forget. The memories of children left alone for months on end to fend for themselves, with no idea of what the next moment might hold. Alone and afraid. That's how life for me had been defined for too long. That night, my grandmother and my great-grandmother put me in bed with them, between the 2 of them. The bed was high up off the floor. I needed a stool to get into it, and after I was in that bed, Grandma pushed the stool up under the bed. I lay awake for a long time, my darling dear Grandma brushing my hair and singing to me. I held her hand tight and fought not to cry as I thought of that skull of the person that died, and thinking, too, that I might have died like my mother was dying. I might still die and never be given the chance to live if I were to become ill as my mother had. It was raining when I woke up, not remembering when I fell asleep. I was standing on the marble steps of Mama's porch. I wasn't sure how I'd gotten here, but then I'd awakened before recently and not been in my bed. I looked out into the yard at the rose garden. A kind of light gleamed bright, and I squinted my eyes to see what it was. A woman, dressed in a soft blue dress that reached to the top of her shoes, with a scarf around her slender neck, walked toward me, and she smiled. The smile didn't look happy. The smile almost seemed to be sad. And then she was saying my name. She knew my name. She spoke to me, and I stood still in that rain, listening to her every word. I couldn't not listen to her. I couldn't turn away from her. "You found my baby today," she said in a voice rich with a southern accent, very much like my own. "I'm your aunt. I lived in this house once, long ago, and here is where my husband killed me. He also killed my baby, and he buried her out back in the gully before leaving here. I want my child with me," she said the last words in a pleading voice. "Please, see my child has returned to me." I watched with a puzzled frown as she faded away, the night gone and only darkness around me. I hadn't been afraid. To me, this aunt had seemed real. Yet in that moment, I knew without doubt I'd just seen a ghost. "Christy," my grandmother said my name from behind me, and I turned around quickly. "Darling, what are you doing out here?" she asked of me in a soft and soothing way. She hurried to me and rushed me inside the house as I told her about the aunt and the baby and the husband that was my uncle that did murder in this house and then buried the baby out back in the gully. My great-grandmother, I called her Mama, was standing in the long hallway, and her eyes locked with Grandma's eyes as she whispered loudly to my grandma that no one spoke of that story to children for fear that it would give them nightmares. How had I found out of what had taken place in this house decades ago? She asked in a harsh voice, not harsh to me, but to Grandma. Grandma shook her head and looked down at me with a kind face. "Darling, who told you about my aunt?" "She said she was my aunt, Grandma, and I was in the rose garden when she told me just a few minutes ago," I answered simply. "Please, she wants her baby. I found her baby today." Silence filled the room as Grandma helped me dry off and put on a new nightgown. When I was tucked up into the bed again, I heard them talking of my great-grandma and how her sister had been murdered in this house. They never said this aunt's name, only that she lived in this house long, long ago when she had first married, and she had indeed died here, murdered just as she told me. The next morning, Grandma called the sheriff. She learned that the skull I found was a baby, and the remains were old enough to belong to the aunt that had been murdered in this house. After a few weeks, the remains were buried in our family cemetery, next to the aunt that was said to be the baby's mother. I was there when they put the remains of the baby, safely tucked in a beautiful box, into the ground. I remember crying for the baby that didn't get to live, as I had gotten a chance to live. It seemed to an 8-year-old girl so horribly unfair to die so young. The summer passed, we children got better, and soon it was time to return home. The day before we left, Grandma took me to the cemetery. I wanted to say goodbye one more time to the baby and the aunt. Standing alone and still before the new headstone that had been placed above the baby, I could only stare at the name on that cold marble stone. You see, the name on that stone was my own. The name of the poor murdered baby had been Christy. I thought of my mother, of how ill my mother was, and I remembered the horrible fear wasn't as bad as it had been at the start of the summer. And then I thought of the beautiful aunt that had visited me in the rose garden. She wanted her baby. She wanted her baby so badly that she had actually come back for her baby. Maybe I was wanted too. Maybe I was loved. Maybe my mother would come back to get me when my time was at hand, as my mother was dying and leaving me. I turned and looked at my darling grandmother, standing by the car and watching me, her thinking me of old, even though I was just a little girl. I ran to her. I remember running to her and wrapping my arms around her legs and her touching my hair. It was a long road home, Christy. she said in a tear-filled voice. "But you made it, baby, and I love you." I hugged her tighter, and I knew I was home. I would always be home in Grandma's arms. The end.